This video is about Elijah and how he links with Joshua. Now here on the screen we see Elijah introduced into the record. And Elijah the Tishbite, who was of the inhabitants of Gilead, said unto Ahab, As Yahweh God of Israel liveth, before whom I stand, there shall not be dew nor rain these years, but according to my word. Now, it's often commented upon this introduction of Elijah into the record that he's introduced very abruptly. There's no mention, for example, of his parents, and it's just very abruptly introduced into the record. But actually, when we look at the context, we see that there is a sort of introduction. If we just have a look at the last verse of the previous chapter, we see how it links up with that first verse in chapter 17, not least because the chapter 17 begins and Elijah. So let's just read the passage again, but this time taking into account the verse which precedes the verse we just read. In his days did Hiel the Bethelite build Jericho. He laid the foundation thereof in Abiram his firstborn, and set up the gates thereof in his youngest son, Segub, according to the word of Yahweh, which he spake by Joshua the son of Nun, and Elijah the Tishbite, who was of the inhabitants of Gilead, and so on. So we see there that Joshua is mentioned in the sentence before Elijah. So there might well be some significant links between these two men. Now notice that it says in that verse, verse 34, the end of chapter 16, it says, according to the word of Yahweh. And then at the end of verse 1 of chapter 17, Elijah says to Ahab, but according to my word. And in fact, if you check out in the concordance, the word with Hebrew isn't quite the same. According to the concordance, the word according, where Elijah is speaking, is actually the Hebrew word for mouth. But we see the emphasis here on the word, that Joshua had spoken those words all that time ago, but they had nevertheless come to pass. And the word which Joshua would speak would come to pass, because of course they were both speaking the words of God. And so there is a link between these two men. One of the reasons why we see these two verses next to each other is this point about according to the word. Just as surely as Joshua's word had come to pass, the word which he had, the word of God which he had spoken, so too would the words of Elijah. But there are other links between these two men. In Joshua chapter 3 and verse 17 we read, And the priests that bare the ark of the covenant of Yahweh stood firm on dry ground in the midst of Jordan, and all the Israelites passed over on the dry ground until all the people were passed over clean over Jordan. And we see a similar thing happened with Elijah and Elisha. In 2 Kings chapter 2 and verse 7 we read, And 50 men of the sons of the prophets went and stood to view afar off, and they too stood by Jordan. And Elijah took his mantle and wrapped it together and smote the waters, and they were divided hither and thither, so that they too went over on dry ground. So both Elijah and Joshua passed over the Jordan on dry ground. In Joshua chapter 4 and verse 8 we read, And the children of Israel did so as Joshua commanded, and took up 12 stones out of the midst of Jordan, as Yahweh spake unto Joshua, according to the number of the tribes of the children of Israel, and carried them over with them unto the place where they lodged, and laid them down there. So we see the children of Israel, under the command of Joshua, taking 12 stones, we're told, according to the number of the tribes of the children of Israel. And of course, in the next verse, we also read of Joshua taking up another 12 stones, which he puts in the midst of Jordan. So, 12 stones according to the number of the tribes of the children of Israel. Now, if you go to 1 Kings and chapter 18, where we find Elijah confronting the prophets of Baal. In 1 Kings chapter 18 and verse 31, we read, "And Elijah took 12 stones according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, unto whom the word of Yahweh came, saying, Israel shall be thy name." So Elijah too took 12 stones according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob. So there's another parallel between these two men. In Joshua chapter 6 and verse 4, here we read of the events leading up to the taking of Jericho. And in verse 4 we read that God said to Joshua, "And 7 priests shall bear before the ark 7 trumpets of ram's horns, and the 7th day ye shall compass the city 7 times, and the priest shall blow with the trumpet." So we see the recurring use of the number 7 there, including that reference to 7 times. And when in 1 Kings chapter 18, when Elijah was praying for rain, we read in 1 Kings chapter 18 and verse 43, and he said to his servant, "Go up now, look toward the sea." And he went up and looked and said, "There is nothing." And he said, "Go again 7 times." So we see several specific links between Joshua and Elijah. So what's the significance of these links? Well, we've already seen the significance in relation to the Word of God, the importance of the Word of God and how it would come to pass. And of course later on Elijah would hear the still small voice of God. There's another link as well, because here, because one of the key things that Joshua did was to bring the people into the land so that they could inherit the land. So in Deuteronomy 3 verse 28 we read of how how God said that Joshua would cause them to inherit the land. And then later on in Joshua chapter 11 and verse 23 we read, "So Joshua took the whole land according to all that Yahweh said unto Moses, and Joshua gave it for an inheritance unto Israel." Now later on we find Elijah watching over this inheritance. And so in 1 Kings chapter 21, when Ahab was trying to obtain the vineyard of Naboth, we read, "And Naboth said to Ahab, Yahweh forbid it me that I should give the inheritance of my fathers unto thee." And then later on God said to Elijah, "Arise, go down to meet Ahab king of Israel, which is in Samaria. Behold, he is in the vineyard of Naboth, whither he is gone down to possess it. And thou shalt speak unto him, saying, Thus saith Yahweh, hast thou killed and also taken possession?" So Joshua brought in the children of Israel into the land and caused them to inherit it. And later on, Elijah, one of his roles was to watch over this possession and to deal with Ahab when he sought to gain possession of part of the land wrongfully. So we see then that there are several links between Joshua and Elijah. When we read of Elijah being introduced into the record in 1 Kings chapter 17, let's not forget to take heed to the last verse of the previous chapter where it speaks of Joshua. The 1 Kings 17 begins with the word and that shows that there is indeed a link between Joshua and Elijah.